stories. In closing, I want to share a humble thank you. Thank you to all Montana's heroes. I don't know what we would do without you. Thank you for your service. You're wonderful. You're aces. We all deeply appreciate all that you're doing. Mr. President, I yield the floor. It's just absent the quorum.
Clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Acosta. President, I ask unanimous consent that further proceedings in the quorum call be dispensed with.
Without objection.
Thank you, Mr. President. As you know, there is a great deal of discussion going on right now in different forums on whether or not to increase our debt limit, and as a part of that, how we can reduce this government's spending practices so that we won't have to keep extending the debt ceiling in the future. Those conversations include a lot of focus on reducing spending in the near term and finding ways to reform some of the entitlement programs so that spending will also be reduced over the long term. Because I think everyone agrees that the current way in which we spend money, 40 cents of every dollar of which has to be borrowed, is literally going to result in bankruptcy if we don't bring it under control. Now, there are those who say, well, actually, the answer to the problem is to increase revenues, meaning raise taxes. The problem with that, Mr. President, is that we didn't get into this problem because we didn't tax enough. We got into the problem because we've been spending too much. The simplest way to think about it is, historically, we spend about 20% of the gross domestic product. Under the Obama budgets, we're going to be spending, and almost spend this much right now, 25% of the gross domestic product. And that's a spending increase that's not sustainable. Even under the largest of deficits, when President Bush was president, it was less than $500 billion. But under the Obama budgets, it's $1.5 trillion, almost exactly for every year for the last 3 years and on into the future. The result is that under the president, we will have doubled all of the debt that this country has accumulated from the time that George Washington was president all the way through the time that George Bush was president. You double that under the Obama administration. The problem is spending. It's not taxes. Evidence of that was presented last Thursday in an op-ed piece in the Wall Street Journal. And at the conclusion of my remarks, I'm going to ask unanimous consent that be put in the record, because I think that it makes the point, and I'll quote from it, or at least discuss some of the arguments in this piece right now. It was put together by Cato Institute Senior Fellow Alan Reynolds, who has written on the subject in the past and is a real student of the effect of tax rates on economic growth and on revenues for the country. And one of the points that he discusses in this op-ed is what happens when you raise tax rates, as some of our friends, particularly on the other side of the aisle, want to do as part of this deficit reduction exercise. Do you necessarily increase revenues if you raise tax rates? What are the impacts on the economy? What happens, on the other hand, if you're able to reduce tax rates? Now, there's no plan on the table here to actually reduce tax rates, but I think the arguments that he presents here make it clear that lower rates do not necessarily produce less revenue, and in fact can have a salutary impact on economic growth and therefore job creation, which is, of course, what we're trying to be all about here. He has studied tax rates for the last 6 decades, and here is some of the factual information that he comes out with. And the conclusion is this: higher tax rates do not necessarily lead to more revenue. In fact, recent history has often shown just the opposite. Now, here are some specific examples. Back when the highest tax rate in this country was 91%, if you can just think about that, 91% tax rate. Why would anyone work to make that last dollar when 91 cents of the dollar that you earn goes to Uncle Sam? But in any event, that was the highest tax rate. The lowest tax rate was 20%. Now, today, the lowest tax rate is 0, and the next 10%, and then 15%, and so on. So this was a much more progressive tax code. Well, individual income tax revenues during that time were 7.7% of the gross domestic product. Now, President Kennedy came along and proposed cutting both the highest and the lowest rates. So they went from 91 down to 70 and from 20 down to 14%. Well, what happened to the 7.7% revenues? They rose to 8% of gross domestic product. So the rates were reduced, but the revenue to the Treasury was increased. What happened a few years later when that was done? When President Reagan first cut the top rate from 70% down to 50%. Did revenues go up? No. Revenues rose again. Reduced taxes, revenues to the government here increased to 8.3% of the gross domestic product. Third example, 1986, when the top rate was slashed again from 50% down to 28%, almost in half. Well, you'd think revenues would really decline. No. They remained almost exactly the same, 8.1%, from 8.3 to 8.1%. So his research clearly demonstrates that the link between lower rates and lower revenues is very weak, if not actually a converse relationship. The relationship between higher taxes and economic difficulty could not be more clear. Let's talk about what happens when you have increases in the tax rates. When in the early 1990s, under the Clinton administration, the top rate was increased to 31%, which, by the way, is more comparable to about 35% in today's dollars because of hidden taxes, the country quickly fell into a recession, and revenues actually dropped to just 7.8% of GDP. So you think you're going to raise more revenue and reduce the deficit by raising tax rates? Wrong. We raised taxes, revenues actually dropped, and the country went into a depression. Now, when the top two tax rates were raised later to 36 and 39.6%, and taxes on Social Security increased as a part of the Clinton tax hikes, revenues again barely moved, 8%, so from 7.8 to 8%. The government actually collected more tax revenue when the top rate was just 28%. So it's simply not true that you can raise tax rates and therefore get more revenue to the Treasury and therefore reduce the debt and the deficit. It's especially not true if you're only talking about doing that for the very highest tax earners, because they don't make enough to produce the kind of revenue that would be required to reduce the deficit that much. Now, to be sure, there are always fluctuations, and there is not a very specific causal relationship in all cases between rates and revenues collected. For example, during the technology bubble of the 90s, revenues rose above 9%. We were really on a roll. People made more money. The government made more money as a result. But, interestingly enough, this was only after capital gains taxes were cut from 28% down to 20%. There is almost a direct relationship between, or inverse relationship, I should say, between the capital gains tax rate and revenues collected. As that rate goes up, less revenue is collected. As the rate comes down, more revenue is collected because it is a tax on economic activity. And the lower the tax, the more economic activity you have, and therefore the more the federal government receives in revenues, even though the rate is lower. Reynolds found a similar correlation between rates and revenues with capital gains as he identified with ordinary income taxes. Just a couple of other statistics here. When the capital gains rate was 28%, revenues were 2.5% of the GDP. After the rate was cut down to 20%, capital gains revenues rose to 4.6% of GDP. So you cut the tax rate and the revenues almost doubled. Now, as I said, capital gains are the most sensitive to rate reductions or rate increases of all of our tax rates. Nonetheless, it's an impressive figure to demonstrate that at least you don't want to be raising tax rates even if you're not willing to reduce them. Summary here. After both ordinary income and capital gains tax rates were cut to 35% and 15% respectively in 2003, individual income tax revenues were 8.1% of GDP, which was higher than the period when the ordinary income tax rate was 39.6% and capital gains rate was 28%. So almost no matter how you look at it, you can see this relationship, and it's almost an inverse relationship. Again, I'm not claiming that all tax cuts pay for themselves or that in all cases this is exactly the way it works out. But to assume that we can solve part of our problem by raising tax rates, and especially raising them on the people who are most able to move income around to avoid paying taxes or minimize their tax rates, I should say, and who are the most susceptible to the capital gains rates, and who are the people most able to invest in business and therefore help to create jobs, to suggest that increasing their tax rates is a good idea is obviously not true based upon the research that Mr. Reynolds has done. Bottom line, lower tax rates do not necessarily mean less revenue. Higher rates do not always mean more revenue. And the facts frequently point to just the opposite. Now, there's obviously more to consider here than just how much revenue will be raised. Unfortunately, higher tax rates also have a very pernicious effect on economic growth and job creation. And Reynolds research in this area is very clear as well. When surtaxes were imposed in our economy back in 1969 and 1970, our economy fell into one of the deepest recessions we've had until the one we're in right now. During the bracket creep of the 1980 to 81 period, when inflation forced taxpayers to pay higher rates till that was fixed later, the economy again fell into a recession. And following the rate increases of 1990, the economy fell into a recession. So it's pretty clear that higher taxes are the last thing that you need to do or want to do during a time of persistently high unemployment and struggling economy as we have today. And yet, as I said, there are some members of Congress and the administration who have proposed raising tax rates as a way to address the deficit. I even saw an academic, read that an academic proposed a 70% rate. And one witness before the Senate Finance Committee, believe it or not, even suggested that a tax rate of 90% would maximize revenue. To show you just how counterintuitive that is, let me just ask the question. What two tax rates produce zero revenue? Well, the answer is zero, of course, and 100%. If you're going to tax 100% of what somebody makes, he's not going to bother to make the money. It doesn't do him any good. And it doesn't do him much good if he only gets to save a dime out of a dollar that he makes, if the government takes 90%. So it's just not true that sticking the rich with a really high tax rate is going to bring in more revenues to the government. Those people don't have to make the money. They can shift it around so they can minimize their tax burden. And eventually what that does is put even a greater burden on the rest of us. It puts a greater burden on middle Americans who aren't that wealthy, who can't move their money around, who have to take it and spend it to support their families, send their kids to school, or for health costs, or whatever it might be. And that's just why you cannot solve this problem by raising taxes. You've got to focus on the side where all of the growth has been, which is increased spending. At the end of the day, Mr. President, the American people believe that wasteful Washington spending has got to stop. And that's why they're saying to many of us, don't raise the debt ceiling, at least until you've made sure that we're not going to have to keep doing this in the future because spending keeps going up. Let's have a down payment on significant savings now. Let's set the budget numbers for the next 10 years so that they actually represent a reduction in spending, not an increase. Let's have entitlement reform that shows that even after that 10 years, the expenses will continue to, if not fall, at least rise less quickly so that our economic growth can manage any increase in costs. And let's do that in such a way that we absolutely put constraints on Congress and the President. We put us in a straitjacket, so to speak, so that we can't create exceptions and waivers and get around it in other ways. Unless we do those things, I don't think most of the people on my side of the aisle are going to have an appetite for increasing the debt ceiling. I know I'm not. And I'm going to look at the historical evidence that people like Alan Reynolds point out to us here, the evidence that clearly shows that higher tax rates do not necessarily translate into higher revenues. In fact, in many of the cases, it's precisely the opposite. It's why, beyond the obvious economic costs, it's foolish to propose higher rates as a solution to our fiscal crisis. Mr. President, I ask unanimous consent that the Wall Street Journal op-ed that I mentioned be inserted in the record at the conclusion of my remarks.